Hey guys, thank you so much for joining the Female Fitness Summit. I was honored to be asked to be a part of this group. There's so many amazing women on this panel, and I'm really excited to give this presentation. So my talk is going to be about effective coaching strategies for nutrition adherence and mindset growth. So everything that I do as a coach, of course, centers around the program and around the principles that we're using. But really, these are the most important things, and this is what separates successful clients. So interchangeably, you'll see me talk in the context of coach or client. And I do this so that everybody listening to this presentation can get the most out of it. So just briefly, a little bit about myself. My name is Lauren Conlon. I am the owner of Team Loco Fit. We are a team of coaches. So it's myself, 3 assistant coaches, training director, and a mental health consultant. So we really try to bring a holistic approach to our coaching team and offer the best services that we can through online coaching. I do have my bachelor's and my master's in exercise science, and I worked with Dr. Bill Campbell for my master's. He's amazing if you guys are not familiar with his research out at USF. He's really pioneering female physique research, which is a very niche subject, but something that we all can appreciate here. And then lastly, I am an IFU bikini pro. I've been competing since 2011, so I've learned a ton through both my education, in school, and then also just real life experiences as a competitive athlete. And that really has shaped my coaching career. So here we go. What separates successful clients? So there's going to be attributes that we typically think of for people who are successful. Work ethic, consistency, dedication, all these things are like one part of the equation. Genetics are an obvious other piece too. I always want to say that up front, and that's not to be negative, but there's always going to be people who are, genetically elite, and maybe they get away with, not having the best program or not having the best adherence. But for most people, we're going to need to have some combination of these two things. But really, once you've controlled for these other variables, right? Work ethic, your consistency, your genetics, all this stuff, what truly separates successful clients are really these coaching strategies and these coaching relationships that, I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So most people like to ask highly specific, very nuanced questions that are just laser focused on these small aspects of what could make them successful as clients or coaches. And I totally appreciate those questions, and I love those questions. But I feel like sometimes we get so focused on this tiny piece and like these nuanced questions that we can sometimes lose the bigger picture. So for this presentation, I will focus on nutrition adherence and mindset growth for clients. It really focuses kind of on that bigger picture and really lays that foundation, what is actually necessary for long-term growth. Because without these principles, you personally, or you as a coach, are really going to struggle to get your point across to clients. And then they're going to, do the typical yo-yo diet. They're going to do the typical start and stop and never really make any progress. And that's what we're really trying to avoid as both coaches and clients. So the 3 main parts that I'm going to talk through today are building long-term goals, and short-term goals kind of within that, playing to your strengths and minimizing weaknesses. And then lastly, developing a positive stress perception, which is such a key thing. And I absolutely love talking about this and presenting on this because it's really been a game changer, not only for myself personally, but for all the clients that I've worked with as well. So first part, we're going to build a long-term vision with short-term goals kind of inside of there. And you guys will see, I do have a lot of kind of words on the presentation. I personally like that as I'm presenting, but especially in like an online format. But also I want you guys to be able to pause this and to look at it and to take notes as needed. So you guys kind of have that, or if you just want to listen auditory, then you can go back and look at this later. So just wanted to give a little heads up there for some of the slides that are a little bit wordier, but they're still easy to read. So building a long-term vision of the direction that you want to go is really essential in any area of life. We know this, right? But especially when it comes to health, fitness, and your physique goals. This seems a lot more intuitive for things like our finances, things like work, relationships, right? But we often put these types of visions on the back burner for our own health for whatever reason, right? Like, hey, I need to have a budget for my life. So I need to see where do I want to go? I'm trying to buy a house. You wouldn't just be like, maybe I'll buy a house someday. No, if you want to buy a house, you're going to have to budget appropriately and spend money and save money appropriately. So why wouldn't you do this for your health and fitness goals? Part of it is because our brains are really wired for convenience. And this is why quick fixes and challenges and short bursts of effort towards specific goals are very tempting, and they seem very rewarding. And that's really just kind of what people gravitate towards. We can see this played out a lot and sometimes exploited in the fitness industry on a pretty consistent basis, because again, this is what we're going for. Everybody wants that quick fix. Everybody wants to put their effort into something for a short amount of time. But doesn't always work out that way. So things like moderation, long-term planning, modest restraint, it's not really what gets people excited, but it is what actually works. But, a big but, this doesn't mean that, the smaller goals within this should be ignored, right? So I think that building short-term goals into the long-term vision is absolutely essential to keep yourself or your clients focused and excited in this progress, right? In this process. If you were a coach, right, like talking about the same topic, understand that this is absolutely the hardest sell that you're going to have to make to people. Clients are going to reach out to you because they want to make changes. They're ready to do things right now. Otherwise, they wouldn't have reached out to you. Occasionally, as a coach, you're going to get somebody who's like, hey, I'm not looking for coaching right now. I'm looking for maybe somebody in a few months. But generally speaking, most people are fed up with what they've been doing. They're looking for something new. They're looking for direction. They're very motivated for change. They don't want to be like, hey, I'm going to hire you for coaching. And then you're like, all right, I can help you, but it's going to be like 3 years. They're like, what? Excuse me? Like, I want to do this right now. And it's just generally unmotivating and can turn a lot of people away from your business. And you might have the best coaching practices. You might really be the best option that they have. But because of the way that you're packaging this kind of long-term vision for them, it might not be enough to bring them in necessarily. This doesn't mean that you have to change your long-term vision for the client. Because it still might take 3 years for them to achieve whatever they're working towards. But you can still give them smaller short-term goals. I almost put smaller and short-term as like one word. Smaller and short-term goals along the way do need to be, baked in there. Otherwise, it's defeating and it's overwhelming. And, somebody's coming to you, like I said, in a position to where they really want to change and they really want to, that's why they hired you. They're very excited. So it can be just very defeating if you say like, there's, we have a really long way to go, like, and it's going to take us multiple years, like, and then they might not even sign up. And ultimately that's what we want to avoid. So as a coach, we all want to attract the serious client. We all want to attract the client who has no problem chipping away at this long-term, very, ominous goal, right? Like we want that type of a client. So the best way to do this, of course, is to, create content and education surrounding these types of coaching principles so you are getting more serious inquiries. But the reality is, even the most intrinsically motivated and patient clients still need something to look forward to. So that is what your job as a coach is, to strategically bake short-term goals into their program to do just that. And we're going to go over some examples coming up. You can still want, serious clients. You can still create your content around that. But it doesn't mean that if somebody still wants a short-term goal or wants something to reach towards, that they're, somehow now less serious. Like, no, they're just as serious. They want to do this, but it's your job to keep things excited and exciting. Put yourself in their shoes. Like, nobody wants to have nothing to work towards. Like, it's just not realistic for really anybody. So if you're a client listening to this, or you're just somebody who, is doing this on your own, you've decided to reach out to an online coach, or you want to pursue a new goal, on your own. You're, again, very excited to get going. Like, you want to start this right now. Okay, it was Sunday, you put together this plan, finally, like, it's Monday, like, let's do this. So motivation is high, you feel fresh, you're ready to tackle shit, like, let's do this. But regardless of this initial enthusiasm that you might feel, you really do need to kind of take a step back, detach from those emotions, and set up a proper game plan. Figure out what your actual long-term goal is for yourself and for your health, performance, and physique goals. Like, what do those look like? You need to figure that out first. Essentially, you need to reverse engineer what needs to be done in order to get there in a sustainable way that's going to create this long-term change. So again, if your goal is, which we're going to go over, lose X amount of pounds, or hey, I want to get on stage, or hey, I want to, lift this much weight. You don't just say, okay, it's Monday, I'm ready to do it. Like, no, you kind of need a plan on how to get there. If you're doing this alone without a coach, it's very, very important to be realistic. And that can be hard because when you have nobody to kind of be your sounding board, it can be a lot harder to be realistic. Let's say you are doing this with a coach, they will help you through this process if you're with the right coach. If you are pursuing the latter option of working with a coach, make sure that you're going into this process with a stable mindset. And I say that in the most, just kind of neutral way possible. You don't go into this and expect to hear these magical things like, I'll get you to your goal in 10 weeks, like no problem, or we can fix the years of bad eating behaviors in just a few months. Like this will be so easy. Honestly, guys, if you hear these types of things, quickly decipher that this might not really be a credible coach who's putting your long-term vision first. The people who are putting your long-term vision first are going to say things that are very upfront with you and be like, hey, it might take us this much time to get to your goal, but here's what we're going to do in the first few months. And this is where we can probably expect to be. That's realistic. That's still giving you something to work towards, but it is being realistic again. I would never tell a client like, yep, this is exactly where we're going to be in a few weeks or a few months. Like we can do it. Or, the notorious like 12-week prep. That might work for some people, but it really doesn't work for most people in, a realistic setting. So I want to go through 2 client examples of what this might look like. So for the first one, this is a lifestyle client looking to lose 30 pounds and, improve a handful of health markers, feel more confident in her physique, improve her relationship with food. This is actually a very common client example, but it also happens to be one of the most vulnerable situations that does get exploited by a quick fix. So believe it or not, it still might take this client several years to reach their ideal body composition and develop those ideal eating patterns or behaviors. Even though somebody might be like, oh, it's 30 pounds, that's not like 100. Okay, it's not 100, but it's still 30. And if we're actually looking to get this off and keep it off, not just like losing 30 pounds is very different than keeping 30 pounds off. And fixing any kind of eating behavior or eating patterns and really just improving your relationship with food does take a very long time. Unfortunately, I wish these were things that could be quicker, but they just can't. So even though this might take a long time, it doesn't mean that there can't be these mini milestones or accomplishments that we're working in along the way. So again, remember, understand the long-term vision of exactly where you or the client are trying to go first and foremost. So first, we're going to work on building up calories, consistently weight train, and add in diet flexibility. Do this for a few months, always the best place to be. Why? We're consistently building up calories. That means you're metabolically going to be in the best place possible. That typically means hormonally, you're going to be in the best place possible in order to diet. You wouldn't want to be kind of haphazardly eating or eating fairly low calories and expect then your body to just respond awesome to a diet. It's not going to work. Consistently weight training is incredibly important. For people who have a background in training, awesome. But many people who are going to be reaching out to you, or maybe even you yourself listening, might not have a really large muscular base. And when people say, oh, I don't need to be that muscular, it's like, no, I didn't say that. But having muscle and just consistently weight training is so, so important. People think it's so easy to build muscle. It's really not. So even if you are consistently training, you are, most likely still just going to have a moderate amount of muscle mass. So building up your calories metabolically, hormonally in the best place possible. We're going to weight train. So we're going to get, again, metabolically and from a muscular perspective in the best place possible. And then diet flexibility really is key. This is something that as a team, Team Local Fit really, really harps on. And it's something that some people don't necessarily understand, but it's something that is incredibly important to myself and all the coaches. And really what diet flexibility just means is having flexibility with your diet. So sometimes that means you're going to be, tracking things like macronutrients. Sometimes that means you're going to be tracking habits. Sometimes that means you're just going to kind of be intuitively eating with some kind of restraint in your life. With some of your habits, we're going to talk about restraint a little bit later, but really being able to kind of go with the ebbs and flows of life and being flexible to handle really any situation. So a little bit more on that later. So you're going to do this for several months. You're going to put yourself in the best pace possible. Now you can embark on a cutting phase where you or the client successfully lose some body fat, maybe not all of the goal weight, but some body fat. You're going to try to maintain as much muscle mass as possible. Again, you're not only going to look better, but you'll feel better and metabolically be in a better place. And then you're going to keep flexibility within reason. It's, obviously when you are in a calorie deficit and you are losing body fat, things are going to need to be tighter, but it doesn't mean that you need to be so rigid and that you lose any kind of flexibility either. So now you're going to do this now for several months, just like you did the first phase for several months. And then you repeat the first cycle, and then you repeat the second cycle. And then after several years of this, you or the client will have successfully reached their goal while also having the tools needed to have a happy and healthy life without you or after you. What is the alternative, right? The alternative is what we know all too well. Crash diet, trash your metabolism, trash your hormones, lose muscle mass, worsen your relationship with food. Great. These are all awful things. And this really, what it does is it not only puts you in a worse spot, it digs you deeper into these feelings of incompetency and low self-esteem, which then of course make you want to diet again and restrict again and go through this yo-yo pattern again. And this cycle continues for a lot of people, unfortunately, for very, very long periods of time. And then they look up and they say, wow, where am I? I don't want to be here. And that's really why these things take so long, because typically the types of clients, at least that come to us and are most likely coming to you guys, have a long dieting history. This is not their first rodeo. This is not the first time they've dieted, tried to lose weight. This is maybe the 10th time they've tried to do this. So that is also why I always talk about being realistic and saying, hey, if you've been doing this for the past 10 years, we're not going to fix this in 12 weeks. That would be awful coaching on my end if I said something like that. So it's understanding, okay, hey, long-term goals, but now we're baking in these short-term, bursts of excitement, right? Like whether it's a mini cut or we're going to work on training or we're going to do this, whatever it might be, like you have to work those smaller goals in. So now let's take a second example, right? This is now a competitive physique athlete looking to earn their pro card in their respective division. So again, very common example, especially for our team as well. And this one is exploited for the same reasons as the first example. Typically, I would say 95% of the time, there are pretty harsh metabolic adaptations that are at play with the severe nature of competitive physique sports. And also very specific psychological neuroses that physique athletes are more susceptible to feel and develop. So this is just a very different situation. The metabolic adaptations come from being so lean, and that is just what needs to happen for the athlete for a short period of time. And then the psychological neuroses that can kind of happen just are compounded by not only the metabolic adaptations and the leanness of the athlete, but also of the competitive nature and just how the competitive event kind of goes into play. So there's a lot going on with physique athletes that need to be managed slightly different than a lifestyle client. But one of the things too is that realistically, most physique athletes don't have enough muscle mass to be competitive. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, people can diet down of like, oh, I just wasn't lean enough. And sometimes that is the case. Sometimes a client is not lean enough. But oftentimes a client is not only either not lean enough, or they were lean enough, but they didn't have enough muscle. And that's where people, can, again, genetics play a role. Where your muscle sits, how it sits is going to affect this. But really you do need to typically have more muscle in order to be competitive. So what does this mean? It means that you're going to need multiple off seasons to actually build the appropriate amount of muscle mass to be successful. And then in this case, we're talking about earn a pro card. Muscle is not built for most clients when they're in a deficit. Of course, there's always outliers, but most do not. And this is very intuitive to us. If we have a basic understanding of physiology, we know that. But it also doesn't happen when a client is not recovered. So the recovery period is highly variable and different from client to client, and even prep to prep with the same client. So it really needs to be addressed as that. So for example, say I do a prep, right? And I diet for 6 months, and then it takes me 9 months. I'm recovered, I'm feeling good, making progress. Another time, I might then embark on a 6-month prep again, but now it's going to take me a year to recover for whatever reason. It just did. And then another time it might only take me 6 months. So even client to client, like within that same relationship, it can be different. So again, same situation. We want to take several months to build up calories, get to the best place possible metabolically, hormonally, and mentally before somebody dives into a prep. Again, the physique athlete has to manage a lot because just being at those very, very lean levels of body fat, particularly for women, is very hard on us. It is easier on some people who naturally are a little bit leaner. But no matter what, no matter if you are a lean individual, you're still likely going to have to diet to get on stage. And getting to those just unnatural levels of body fat are very, very hard. So you need to be in the best place possible to minimize those adaptations and kind of keep you going through the prep. So if you or the client have enough muscle, you can enter into a contest prep. Cool. If not, a mini cut might be the best idea to get to a little bit of a lower body fat percentage. But then you're going to have to reverse again before you diet. And this is going to be different. Some people don't like this. Some people would rather just do a longer prep. Some people would rather like to do a little mini cut, then kind of reverse and then get into the prep. It really just depends on you as the client or you as the coach-client relationship, whatever this is. Kind of have to play that by ear and see how somebody's responding. And then, of course, we're going to now, once we're in the best place possible, pre-prep, we're going to diet down for said competition. Afterwards is really kind of where this gets confusing. So you need to give yourself time to recover. I've said this word how many times? But how much time? Like, what does a recovery look like? At minimum, I don't like to give exact numbers because, I could say for somebody, hey, you're going to prep from anywhere from 3 months to 9 months. Like, what? That's the reality. Same thing with recovery. At minimum, though, I would say expect to spend the same amount of time you spent in a prep off. So say, again, that 6-month prep example, it's typically going to take about 6 months to recover at minimum. Some people can be a little bit earlier. Some people are going to need a little bit more. It's just going to depend. And for some clients, this is enough time. For some clients, they're like, hey, I'm good to go, like fully recovered. Hormones are back in check. I have a regular cycle. I'm gaining strength in the gym. I've added muscle. I've added diet flexibility and calories in a good spot. Like, all these things are good. Other people, you might need to double that time. I know again, I'll use myself as an example personally. I started competing in 2011. I did many, many seasons back to back to back to back to back. So I learned a lot of this stuff. And every time I did that, it had a compounding effect. So then finally in 2018, I had a great season. I had a very long prep. It was 9 months. I did 5 shows in that period. It was a very extensive prep. And I'll be honest, it took me 2 years. It took me about 18 months to feel like really good. And then now I would say about 2 years later is kind of when I'm like, yep, like I'm fully recovered. But it wasn't just that last prep. It was all the preps before that I hadn't taken enough time. So these things can compound. So if a client comes to you, they're like, listen, I've prepped for a few years and then now my body's not responding. I don't know what's going on. And you're like, listen, we can't control what happened before. All we can do is assess things now. And they just might need time off from dieting, which is usually the number one answer that I give people. They don't want to hear it, but it is usually the best thing possible. So to the next part, we're going to play to strengths and minimize weaknesses. This is incredibly important as well. So setting yourself up for success is a big part of why clients can be adherent and can be successful over long periods of time. You do this by playing to your strengths, minimizing weaknesses, and understanding what a sustainable diet looks like for you. Everybody is very unique in this situation. So you have to be very honest with your assessment of yourself or your assessment of a client. So when I say adherence, a lot of people initially go, oh, okay, I need to be 110% perfect. I need to be on this diet 365, like all this stuff. I gotta just try harder, go all in. This certainly isn't realistic, far less sustainable. And that's one of the things that we talked about, obviously, before this. And it is quite literally setting yourself up for failure. If you say, I just need to go harder, you are pulling the rubber band back, and at some point it's going to snap. And the harder that you pull it back, the harder it's going to rebound. So I really try to avoid things like this. And this type of mindset is just classic black and white dichotomous thinking. And the research is pretty clear that the more that you engage in this line of thinking, the worse off your outcomes will, in really any particular area, but particularly for your diet and your training. When we're talking about food, this rigidity creates a lot of just paradoxical compensatory behaviors that get you farther and farther from your goals. So like I said, you say, hey, I'm going to be on it 110%, 365, just doing it, right? And you're pulling that rubber band back and you think, okay, I'm doing good. I'm really adherent. But what ends up happening is that, say that rubber band snaps, right? Like you just snap one day and then you have a cookie or two, right? Like you just have that. Rationally, you'd say, okay, this wasn't my best moment. If this wasn't part of what I should have been doing, but I'm just going to move forward, and one or two cookies is not going to completely derail me, and I'm just going to keep moving forward. Typically what happens is when that rubber band was so far back and you were so rigid, you are going to have these compensatory behaviors like, oh, I had 2 cookies. Now I need 36 and 2 pints of ice cream. Logically doesn't make sense. Emotionally it does. And it makes sense when you look at the research and you understand why this mindset is setting you up for failure. So first, you need to really take an honest inventory of your personality traits, right? Are you orderly or are you disorganized? Are you a planner or are you impulsive? Are you somebody who thrives on structure, or do you like a little bit of chaos, right? Like these are all just personality traits, and every single person has their own unique blend of these traits. And this needs to be understood in order to live, your most productive and fulfilling life. Again, not just when we're talking about food and training and all of this, but really for your entire life. I'm just a big proponent of whatever we do with your diet and your training most likely will affect the rest of your life in a positive way, hopefully, if you're doing things properly. So this is one of those things too, that just understanding your personality here is going to be so, so important. But particularly in this case for this presentation, I'm not going to get all out there for you guys, but with your food, your relationship with food and your adherence to your diet, this is incredibly important. So a really great tool is actually, it's called understandmyself.com. Understandmyself.com is the website, and it essentially goes over the big 5 personality traits, which have been discussed in the research for many years and very, very valid. So it goes through the big 5 and it gives you a score. You kind of fit within a percentile for this. So, one of them is extroversion, right? So if you are 100%, that means, you're in the 100th percentile for extroversion. So you're extremely extroverted, you're very talkative, you're comfortable around groups, and hey, that's me. And then, if you were on the other end, you'd be low on extroversion, right? So it gives you kind of this breakdown within the percentiles for all the big 5. And then it also has 2 subcategories too. It's like a 14 or 15 page printout. It's like $10, highly suggest it. And it's great for your personal life, but also when it comes to this type of stuff. So using your personality traits, you can build out your habits to reflect your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. Making it easier on yourself is setting you up for success. How you get there doesn't matter if the result is the same. And a lot of people often try to go for like the hardest, toughest route, which I fully support in some aspects, but in others I don't. And here's where I don't. So let's say, for example, you're a more orderly person who doesn't mind planning. You got 6 calendars at home, you got notebooks for everything, to-do lists, like you thrive off of meal prepping, you thrive off of structure, and you generally like being prepared, right? Like you're a little bit more type A, you're very conscientious, like you're that type of person. Making sure that you are prepped and, you have either, a meal prep service or, you made food at home or both, or you just kind of have a little bit more structure for your days. This is going to, limit impulsivity. And these types of clients generally don't like impulsivity. So that's a win. And it allows them to work within the constraints, that they like. This is setting them up for success. If you told somebody who's very, very, orderly and organized, like, hey, just go order whatever you want when you go out to eat. They're like, oh, okay. It really throws them off. Now, doesn't mean that we can't ever do that. But for most of the meals and most of the week, use your personality, like go off of what you thrive on. And total opposite, like say on the contrary, planning is your downfall. You generally thrive off of, a little bit of chaos. This first option that I just talked about really could be detrimental to you. It could feel very restrictive to you. You could say, oh my God, I'm doing the same thing every day. I don't like this. I really need to have some impulsivity in my life. I just hate all this planning. So instead, for this type of client, or if this is you, find a few easy go-tos at a restaurant that is by your work that you can go and pick up food. Or, when you're traveling or just kind of living your day-to-day life, like make sure there's some easy options that you can grab at the convenience store, the grocery store, restaurant, whatever it is. And then these types of clients are going to do great when they're eating out and they're estimating out all this stuff. Different approach, same result. Ultimately, you're going to have to do things in life that you don't like, especially when it comes to nutrition, right? So I'm not trying to say that if you're a planner, you can't do things that are impulsive, or if you're an impulsive person, that you shouldn't plan. No one really loves eating vegetables, or, I mean, I do like vegetables, but you get what I'm saying. Or displaying restraint when they really want something else, right? Just like, people who are planners, they don't love facing chaos head on. Impulsive clients also need to learn how to manage their time. So it goes both ways. You can't just say, oh, write it off as like, I'm a planner, so I don't ever want to eat out or be impulsive. No, you're displaying control issues now over your food. You need to be able to have a little bit more flexibility, like with your food options kind of in your day-to-day life. Same thing with people who are a little bit more impulsive, a little bit less structured. Doesn't mean that you get away from having some kind of structure just because you're like, oh, that's not my personality type. No, that's not how this works. We have to blend both. But just in general, making sure that you are playing to those strengths is going to be really, really key. So as a coach, you need to figure out what makes your clients tick and create the best plan to accommodate their needs. The analogy of like fitting whatever the square and the circle and the square peg, whatever it is. I'm so bad at analogies. I don't know why every time I do a presentation, I bring up an analogy and then I ruin it mid-talk. So that analogy, you guys know what I'm talking about, where something doesn't fit, right? You don't want to be that person. You don't want to be that coach who's like, no, I told you for the 100th time, we got to do this. There are certain things that I really do harp on with clients that I find are very, very important. But the overall, it's about, figuring out what is the best for your client, managing what as the detached person up here who's seen the bigger picture. Okay, what is the best for my client, but also accommodating their needs along the way is so, so important. And then as a client, you need to be honest with yourself and your coach on what is working, what is creating strain, and how you can do better, right? So for me, I'm a little bit more of a planner. I don't mind prepping things. I don't mind things being similar. But I've also learned how to kind of go with the flow and do that, right? But, if I didn't express that to somebody, or if I was the opposite, right? And all this planning was just really creating strain on me. And as the client, I wasn't telling my coach that. They would have no idea. And then you think as a coach, everything's going great. So having this open, flexible approach and really just having the right communication is what will facilitate this long-term adherence. So communication is the root of everything. If you have bad communication, you're going to have bad, coaching relationships. So being honest and open with yourself first, and then communicating that to your coach is absolutely essential. I talked about in the beginning how we were going to touch on restraint. So here we are. So when you hear the word restraint, it's typically thought of as this one-sided, very restrictive and negative word, right? Like, oh, restraint. I don't have that. I just want to live my life. I want to enjoy things, right? Like I don't have restraint. But this actually isn't the case. So researchers have split restraint into two categories, flexible and rigid. And again, we're talking in the, the sphere of food behaviors and food mindset. So that's what we're talking about here. But you could definitely apply this to life. If you're looking up this research, it is food related. So rigid restraint is typically what we think of when we hear the word restraint. It represents black and white, all or nothing thinking patterns, these types of things. And in relation to food specifically, people who engage in rigid restraint often look at food as good or bad. They're known to label foods. They feel guilt around eating around certain types of foods. They display more impulsivity around eating in general. And they also have more overeating and binge eating behaviors. Remember I talked about that kind of compensatory behavior. So it really is paradoxical, right? So oftentimes people will see this paradoxical overeating when they're trying to be very rigid. For people who have never been in this situation, it's very confusing to them, right? So like if you said to someone who doesn't have these, food issues or these behaviors, like, yeah, this person's trying to, be on a diet, but they were so rigid with their diet then that they overate. Somebody would be like, what? Why would they do that? That goes completely against their goals. Yes, it does. But this mindset and this rigidity is actually what creates those compensatory behaviors. Flexible restraint, on the other hand, represents the complete opposite. So people who engage in flexible restraint don't experience the same food guilt or negative thought behaviors. They typically exhibit more planning before or after higher calorie meals, and they don't experience the same levels of overeating or binging behaviors. And the more planning before and after is really, really key. And when I read this in the research the first time, I was like, wow, this makes a lot of sense. And I've seen this play out with clients. And, this is something that I actually really try to coach people on. Say okay, it's Saturday night, I'm going out like with my girlfriend, with my significant other, whatever it might be. I'm going to have a more calorie dense meal. I might have a few drinks, like whatever it is that you want. Beforehand, if you go into this meal knowing, okay, Saturday night is this, I'm going to have this higher calorie meal. The person who displays rigid restraint might not eat much earlier. They're going to obsess over what's going to happen later that night with that meal, etc. And then they're going to get to that meal. They're going to most likely be very impulsive. They're going to overeat in that meal. And then they might come home and actually continue to eat even when they don't want to. They might continue that behavior the next day. Then they could restrict. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry from restricting. They overeat again, and it becomes this whole cycle, right? Whereas somebody who has a more flexible restraint mindset is going to say, okay, I have a higher calorie meal Saturday night. I'm still going to make sure that I get, several protein meals early in the day. I'm still going to eat meals. I'm not going to be starving going into this. I want to have like normal dinner. They go to the dinner. They have their meal. They have maybe some drinks, dessert, whatever they want. Come home. They don't eat anything else. Next day, they're right back on it. And that's really, when I talk about diet flexibility, what we work on so hard with our clients, because it is such a really horrific thing that people in this industry experience. And I've worked with clients on every spectrum of like very beginner to very advanced, lifestyle client who barely knows how to track their food, all the way up to highly competitive physique athletes. And everybody has dealt with these experiences if they have this very rigid restraint mindset. So this is something that's so important across all spectrums of clients with every goal, in my opinion, to work on to really have this long-term adherence and long-term success. But one thing I want to touch on, which always kind of gets confused, is using flexible restraint does not mean that you get to eat whatever you want. Sorry, this is not a pass for that. Again, kind of like the personality traits, right? Like just because you don't like planning doesn't mean you're not allowed to, like, you don't get a pass, like, oh, I don't want to plan. Cool, that's my personality trait. No, you still have to plan sometimes. So just like with the flexible restraint, this doesn't mean that you just like, oh, I get to eat whatever I want, right? Because it's flexible. No. So there will always be restraint built into a diet that supports health and body composition goals. But how you go about that restraint is what creates the sustainability or not. If you say, oh, in order for me to be healthy, all I can do is eat tilapia, rice, and broccoli, not a very sustainable model. Maybe some meals you eat that, cool. Other times you're going to need to have other foods. So it's just about how you go about that restraint that is really the most important. So as a coach, teaching your clients the difference between the two types of restraint and slowly transitioning them to a more flexible approach is really, really important. Combining a program that focuses on their strengths while allowing them to display flexible restraint with their diet will really be how they successfully adhere to any situation, whether that be calorie deficit, whether that be a business trip, whether that be they don't have any access to prepped food. Like, it doesn't matter what the situation is. There will always be challenges with a diet. But if you are building up their strengths and really, building up this flexible restraint, they're going to be able to use this in any situation that they want. If you're a client, understanding that your natural inclination is likely to be as rigid as possible with your restraint. But this is also why you've likely failed in the past. So too often I hear things from clients like, I should have tried harder, or I need to take my plan more seriously. And this goes back to that kind of rubber band analogy. Like, sure, you do need to do those things. And you actually might need to take things more seriously. I might have a conversation with you as a client to be like, hey, kind of need to get your shit together. Like, you haven't really been the most adherent. You haven't been the best. Like, you are doing these things that are setting you up for failure, technically, right? So there might need to be those hard conversations. But tripling down your efforts for a few weeks, then only say, F it, is going to get you nowhere fast. And that's likely why you failed previously. So take a step back, understand that you can be a little bit rigid sometimes, and that's okay. But really developing this flexible restraint model is going to be so beneficial for everything in your life moving forward. And then the last part of this lecture is developing a positive stress perception. This is one of my favorite things that I've learned about, like I said, over the years. And it's something that sometimes like we know, but we don't really know until we dig a little bit deeper. And it really becomes so obvious why, oh, this is why I failed before. So society and pop culture have taught us that stress is bad, stress is killing us. This is why your blood pressure is high. This is why you have chronic anxiety. This is why you have belly fat. Like, stress is the root of all of these problems, right? Like, that is what we've been told over and over and over again. More stress, more problems, less stress, less problems. We are literally inundated with this message on a daily basis. You've probably said this yourself before. I know I have, right? Like, I used to say these things like, if this was just different, I just would, if I was less stressed, things would be easier. Or that we always have these like fantasies in our mind, right? So to some extent, this is true, but it's only partially true. Quite like the story of restraint, how there's rigid and flexible restraint. Stress is not the problem. It's how you perceive stress that is the problem. And it is like a 2-compartment models. So researchers have discerned stress perception into 2 categories. Stress is debilitating or stress is enhancing. For the sake of this presentation, I will refer to this as negative or positive. It's just a little bit shorter and a little bit easier to talk about. So people who view stress as negative, they think that stress is harmful. They feel that the stress is worsening their health. They feel that it's draining their vitality. They feel that it debilitates their performance and, really worsens their productivity. Like all the negative stuff that we were talking about. Stress is negative. Then there's people who view stress as positive. They think that it's enhancing. They feel that stress will improve their performance and their productivity, and it will also facilitate growth and learning. So it's really not surprising that clients who view stress as enhancing or positive are generally more successful with their nutrition and their training goals. Also, again, with life in general. Everything that I talk about today can be applied to every facet of your life. Just remember that. But especially when it comes to nutrition and training, this is such a simple mindset change. It's so profound. And it really does play out in really every aspect of nutrition and training. So, hitting X macros, doing Y program, it's really only part of the equation, right? It's one part. But how you view these tasks is just as important. I'm not kidding. If you view, so let's just say, okay, food prep example, right? This is so common, something that we talked about, you can probably have to prep some food at some point. You're putting this effort in. Do you view this as a chore? Or is this something that's negative? Like, do you hate it? Is it, oh, it's such a time suck, like I wish I didn't have to do this? Or, are you viewing this effort as something that's positively moving you towards your goals? Yeah, I have to spend an hour meal prepping, but this is going to set me up for success for the week. I feel great about doing this, and it makes my life so much easier during the week. Like, how are you viewing this one simple task? Same task, completely different mindset around it. These seemingly small mindset changes really alter not only how you respond to the program, but how you are going to adhere. Remember, this whole presentation is about adherence for like long-term strategies. This is how you are going to be able to adhere to things. How do people meal prep? I've been meal prepping for literally like so many years. And if I looked at it as this negative thing, it would be such this chore, this awful draining thing I had to do. No, of course, there's some days that I'm like, oh, last thing I want to do is prep some food. But I spend an hour doing that a few times a week. I'm in a much better position, and I know that, and I look forward to that because I know how successful it's going to make me during the rest of the week. And a lot of people will be like, oh, your mindset really doesn't affect your adherence. Like that doesn't really affect, kind of how you respond. And honestly, this is one of the craziest studies, not because the outcome was so crazy, but just because it was just so interesting to me. So I'm just going to read a little bit through it for you guys. So everybody would imagine that, housekeepers are fairly active within their line of work. And, actually their daily activity satisfies the, Surgeon General's guidelines for physical activity. So, whether or not we are like, oh, wow, that's, accurate or not, for the sake of this, like, we'll just say, okay, for most people, that's doing better than being completely sedentary, right? So there's 2 groups. Control group, didn't hear anything. They just went about, doing their normal work at this hotel. And then the intervention group was given a short 20-minute presentation, educating them basically how their work qualified as the recommended amount of physical activity. The control group got nothing. This is what they got: 20-minute presentation. You're probably burning X amount of calories. Like, this is, you're physically active. This is making you healthier. Your job is, good, da, da, da. There was a few posters like in their break room. Like, so just very, very basic. After just 4 weeks, the people and the intervention group perceived that they did significantly more activity by the end of the study from baseline. How much activity do you perceive that you do? They didn't perceive that they did much activity. They actually looked at it like it was like a negative thing. They had this little 20-minute intervention. They had some posters. 4 weeks later, they perceived, same test, I'm doing more activity now, even though their work did not change. They were at a hotel working on the same amount of rooms every single day. And they saw actually health and body comp measurements improve. Now, was it a lot? No, but it was actually statistically significant. And the fact that their diet and their exercise or activity did not change at all really speaks volumes to simply how they perceived this. Now, do I think that if everybody just perceived everything they did so perfectly, they would just, drop inches and never have to diet? Oh, of course not. I'm not saying that. But I am just speaking to how powerful your mindset is going to be. And again, not just for the short term, but for the long term. How are you going to be successful? Not just in this 12-week program, not just in this 6-month package that you signed up for, not even just for the year, but for the next 10 years. How are you going to be successful? And this is the number one thing that I've seen with clients. And I will talk about this as much as I can to every single group that I speak to, because that's how powerful it's been to our clients on our team. So if you are a coach, identifying that your client has a negative stress perception might take some time. But it will become self-evident when you ask the right questions and you get to know them. It's not going to be like the first update. You're like, wow, the person really has a negative stress perception. You might, but you most likely, it will take some time. But if a client is always negative in their check-ins, they can't seem to handle the smallest changes to their plan or really their life. They just generally exhibit a really low stress resilience. It is time to discuss this. As a coach, you need to spend some time to educate yourself on this topic. And a great place to start is reading The Upside of Stress from Kelly McGonigal. It's an absolutely incredible book. I recommend it so much, literally to everybody. That's actually where I read about this study. And, you from there, after you know a little bit more about this, you don't need to be, an expert or, get your master's in psychology to understand this. You have a basic understanding of stress perception and how to make it more positive. From there, you just have an open discussion with your clients about their stress perception and how to actively work on it. Don't say this in a aggressive, angry way. Like, wow, I think you're really negative every week. Like, I wish you would just suck it up and change it. You need to approach it tactfully, because it is hard to hear. Like, if somebody basically came to you and said something that you didn't want to hear, like, that might, you might need to say it in a nice way, but you also do need to be direct about it. You can't just beat around the bush with this. You can't just be like, well, I think things could change a little bit, maybe not. No. You need to be direct. Hey, based on XYZ patterns that I've seen and you've said, and that, what you've exhibited here, you have pretty low stress resiliency. You have pretty poor stress perception. And this is why you're not going to see any adherence. Here's what we can do to change it. So you don't have to be rude, but you do need to be direct with clients. And, people might not want to hear it at first, or they might take a while to process the information, but you saying it is getting that started, and that's incredibly important. So if you're a client in the situation, you might be familiar with your negative stress perception, and you could be actively working on it. If you are in that position, tell your coach that, hey, I know that my proclivity is a little bit more negative. I'm actively working on this. So please check me on it. But if you're not familiar with this and you're not aware of it, and your coach does bring this up, don't take it offensively. Take it as a great thing. Wow, okay, I got, this person who I highly respect and I trust and have a great relationship, several months into working with me, like, they figured this out. Like, they're saying this for a reason. And they want to help me. They're not trying to be rude. They're actually trying to help me. Understand that it will be hard, and it's going to be pretty uncomfortable to work through. One of the, the things people, simple, not easy, that applies a lot, especially here. Shifting your stress perception is simple, right? Like, the examples I gave are pretty simple. Meal prep. Okay, this is a chore and this is frustrating and, debilitating, or this is positive and working me towards my goals. Pretty simple, but is it easy? No, because we find ourselves in the kitchen on Tuesday, like, oh, God damn, I don't want to be doing this, right? Like, we can still find ourselves in that situation, even though it's simple. It's still not easy. Especially if these patterns have been ingrained for years. just like a yo-yo dieting example. You can't expect to just bounce back from something like this if you've always had a negative stress perception. Like, this is something that I am still actively working on. I would say that I feel very comfortable understanding this research. I've looked into this a lot. I've read a lot about it. I've seen it play out in my life and other people's lives, but it's still something that I have to check myself with. I may kind of, just naturally a little bit more on the negative side of things, and that's just my personality. I'm self-aware enough to know that. That's kind of my inclination. So I have to work, okay, let me get more to this side of things. So give yourself some grace. Don't expect this to be accomplished overnight, just like you wouldn't expect any of your body comp or your physique or your performance goals to change overnight. You can't expect your stress perception to change overnight, but the small steps do add up, and they do really make a difference. So I'm going to leave you guys with this quote. This is actually from the book that I was recommending, The Upside of Stress. I just thought it was a really great kind of encompassing quote to round out this message. So we are used to believing that we need to change everything about our lives first, and then we will be happy or healthy or whatever we think we want to experience. The science of mindset says we have it backward. Changing our minds can be a catalyst for all the other things we want to make in our lives. But first, we may need to convince ourselves that such change is possible. And I really thought that that was so, so powerful. And I just wanted to share it with you guys, because how true is that? And we always think like, oh, I need to change everything first and then I'll be fill in the blank. But actually, it's the other way around. We need to convince our mindsets that we can actually have these changes, and then they will happen. So I really appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate you guys joining this summit. I hope you got a lot out of it. Like I said, I know the other speakers are absolutely incredible on this lineup as well. So if you have any other questions, feel free to send them to info@teamlocofit.com. It's the best way to reach us. I greatly appreciate you guys' time, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.